Welcome all to the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. We're delighted to host General James Jones as this year's George Herbert Walker Lecturer in International Studies. And I should say that at the conclusion of today's lecture, which will be right about 5:30, there'll be a reception upstairs to which everybody is invited. The Honorable George Herbert Walker III, Yale class of 1953 and former U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Hungary, established this lecture series in 1986 in memory of his father, a distinguished graduate of the Yale class of 1927. The Walker Lecture is a signature lecture presented every year at the Macmillan Center and has often been one of the most interesting events that we have put on in the year. Past lecturers have included Madeleine Albright, John Major, Richard Holbrook, Mamfele Ramfele, and many others. During his military career, General Jones served as commander of the U.S. European Command, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe from 2003 to 2006, and Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1999 to 2003. He retired from the Marine Corps in 2007 after 40 years of service in the military. But after retirement, Jones remained involved in national security and foreign policy issues. In 2007, he served as chair of the Congressional Independent Commission on the Security Forces of Iraq, which investigated the capabilities of the Iraqi police and armed forces. Later that year, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice appointed him as Special Envoy for Middle East Security. And he served as chair of the Atlantic Council from 2007 to 2009, when he assumed the post of National Security Advisor, a position that he held until last year. The title he has chosen for his lecture today is National Security in the 21st Century. I'm pleased to introduce General James Jones. Welcome, General.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And it really is an honor to be here, especially to be reunited with two people that I have come to admire very, very much, Ambassador and Mrs. Walker, who did such a great job in Europe at a critical time when Eastern Europe was still feeling its way towards its membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its assimilation into the western part of Europe. And as a former NATO commander, I can assure you that we were very grateful to have that dedicated leadership of Ambassador and Mrs. Walker in Hungary. These are difficult times that we live in. Many people talk about the economic problems that we have, and there's a little piece in the Washington Post the other day about one of our congressmen who was walking home from a late voting night from the Hill and was approached from behind by a gunman who put a pistol in his back and said, "Give me your money." And this congressman had had a very hard day, and he turned around and was in a combative mood and looked at his assailant and said, You can't rob me. I'm a United States congressman. You just can't come up and pull a gun and tell me to give you my money." And the assailant looked at him and said, "Okay, well then give me my money." I chose this topic because I think that it's extremely important to understand a few things about where we are in today's world. Throughout history, it seems to me that from empires and civilizations, in fact, to the survival of every single human being on this planet, it has been very, very closely dependent on the ability of nations and individual people to understand the environment that surrounds them in order to be successful, in order to survive in many cases. And more importantly, the quality of being able to recognize when one's environment changes and what one has to do in order to compete in a new environment is critical. And it's more critical today than perhaps at any time in our history. Today we live in a time when our ability to not only understand, but perhaps even more importantly, adjust to changing global environment will probably have a profound impact and effect on the United States and its role as a world power by the 50th year of this still very young century. This profound change will affect the individual fortunes and aspirations of nearly everyone. Certainly everyone in this room today, especially the younger members of the audience. I'm sorry to start off with what some might think as a pessimistic tone, but let me add that by nature I am an optimist, and I don't buy into some of the things I hear talked about, not only in the United States but elsewhere, about doomsday scenarios associated with regard to any sort of decline for the United States. This country has proven time and again that we are resilient, especially in the face of adversity and especially in the face of complex problems. But I do believe, as I mentioned, that we are at a critical intersection in our history, and that if we are to take the right path at this intersection, there must be a clear recognition of the challenges we face. We also need a clearer understanding that the world we had so much to do with creating during the latter half of the 20th century is changing faster than anyone can imagine, with very serious implications that must be addressed. It's been my experience over a relatively long career that the definition of change is what we easily do to someone else. It is not easy to change what we do, as individuals or as institutions or as countries. But we can't compete and we can't be successful without implementing change as environment changes. And this is true of individuals, it's true of businesses, and it's true of nations. What we know about the new environment that we find ourselves in this still young century is that the world is smaller, information travels faster, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is increasing in the world, that speed is important in decision-making, and we even worry about things that we never worried about. We never really worried about climate in the 20th century. We never worried about water supplies. We never really worried about energy, except when the price of a gallon of gas at the pump got a little too high for our comfort. But I remember in 1973 when it got all the way up to $1 a gallon, and what a crisis that caused. We didn't really worry about economics as a national security issue in those days. But nowhere is the need for change more evident than in the area that we refer to as national security. If you consider that just a few short years ago, national security was the exclusive domain of the Defense Department, a small portion of the State Department, and the National Security Council, which is generally also a fairly small group of people. In the national security world of the latter part of the 20th century, we faced a symmetrical challenges of a bipolar world that had, compared to today, a sense of order that no longer exists. If you look back and you think about the serious problems of the 20th century, especially towards the end of the century, it was easy to diagram it. It was easy to understand that institutions that we created from 1945 until the year 2000 to deal with the world as it was were very effective, and we should all celebrate that, because it was this world that we inherited coming into the 21st century. So during the latter half of the 20th century, institutions, both national and international, were created to deal with the challenges of that world, and by and large, things worked out rather well, if one uses the absence of nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union as a benchmark for success. And precisely when the 20th century ended and the 21st century began, in terms of dramatic change, is a subject of much discussion today. But it was certainly, in my mind, around the time that the Soviet Union dissolved. This was an event of historical proportions that took place without so much as a shot being fired. And this is also a fact that historians will continue to be amazed by for many, many, many years. Much was made of that period in terms of what the future might portend when the dissolution of the bipolar world happened. Predictions of global peace, turning swords into plowshares. Some voiced concern about the impact of an unrivaled United States. Even French newspapers referred to us as a hyperpower. In short, the long-term prospect for global peace and tranquility seemed possible, certainly within reach. But a funny thing happened along the way to the new century. On the positive side, several nations took stock of what had made the United States so successful in the 20th century and started to imitate that success, Japan being probably the first, and that was admittedly before the end of the century. But then most recently, China, India, Brazil, the newly reunited and reformed Europe, perhaps the emerging Russia, perhaps other countries that are reforming themselves. But today we face an unprecedented competitive challenges from these newly reformed nations who have established very close links between their public and private sectors. They've recognized that in the globalized world, the ability to make rapid decisions at the national level with regard to their economies is an essential component of any success that they hope to enjoy down the road. In other words, they've done or are in the process of doing what is necessary to make themselves competitive in the 21st century. Now, whether that success is temporary or long-lasting, whether it stands the test of time, and the many other challenges each will face over time, remains to be seen. But clearly, the rise of peer competitors to the United States is a major change to the world as we know it. And it seems to me that we must deal with that challenge more effectively than we are doing today. We have in place today many of the same laws and regulations and policies that were implemented during the last century. Our export control policies are archaic, they're slow, they overly restrict the abilities of our business sector and our corporations to compete in the global market. Countries that wish to do business with the United States are discouraged by the layers of bureaucracy that, quote, make it difficult to do business with the United States. And I put that in quotes because this is something I've heard from many leaders in different parts of the world for the last 5 or 6 years. We live in a world where export control reform is now a national security issue. As another example, we've been trying for years to pass the free trade agreements between the United States and 3 countries, Korea, South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. Agreements that are overwhelmingly in our national interest. But agreements that we have not been able to ratify and due to the smaller and purely partisan parochial interests here at home. Indeed, institutions once thought of as being timelessly efficient now seem paralyzed. Peer competitors challenge the traditional world order. Core elements that used to make up the national security portfolio are more diverse. National leaders in most of our sectors of our society are subjected to standards, expectations, and immediate criticism that, in my view, discourages public service, a condition that is not in our national interest for the long term. Internationally, the global have-nots are saying to their leaders that they know what they are missing and they are not going to take it anymore. Witness the Arab Spring. Not too long ago, Tom Donahue, president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, said the following, and I quote, "America is not keeping up. Other countries are signing trade deals, forging alliances to share natural resources, and are rapidly developing their own domestic energy supplies. Some are cutting taxes and regulations, pushing legions of young people through science, technology, and engineering schools, and building brand new infrastructure in a fraction of the time it takes to build anything here," unquote. In my view, when a nation stops being able to do the things that are in its own interests, the signs of decline cannot be very far behind. Trend lines for our competitive positions in our own hemisphere in Africa, for example, are not encouraging. The world is catching up, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there is still time to remedy the situation, but not nearly the amount of time that some people think there is. It's interesting to note, at least from my perspective, how little of our current political discourse in either party, 1 year before national elections, is being accorded to the issue of American competitiveness in the world. I know that it must sound strange for someone who spent 40 years in uniform to stand before you declaring that American leadership in the economic sector of our society is the biggest threat to our position in the world during the 21st century. But I believe that this is so. Matter of fact, I heard a line the other day from a friend of mine in California who said, "The economy in California is so bad, even the earthquakes are moving east." On the negative side, and I fully understand that my preceding assertions were not exactly uplifting, the ordered world composed of two principal adversaries has largely disappeared. But what has replaced it is not a particularly good thing either. We do face a long-term conflict that is best described as a war of ideologies, in which throughout much of the underdeveloped world we are portrayed as the principal reason for oppression, either by our physical presence on the planet or by our support to forms of government that are considered oppressive by the people. The so-called Arab Spring phenomenon represents just how complex and difficult things are on the global playing field today. The impact of these global changes to our role in the world of the 21st century are profound. In the first place, I am unsure that the body politic has grasped the significance of the difference between the two centuries. To be sure, from a national security perspective, we have made some very important changes that have contributed to our collective safety and security. By combining the National Security Council and the Homeland Security Councils, we have recognized that there is no border where international and national threats are concerned. In other words, you can't delineate where one starts and the other one stops. We created a flatter National Security Council that is better organized to address not only the geographical challenges of different parts of the world, but also the functional challenges of things like cybersecurity, economic development, the linkages between space, global development, terror, and conventional threats are integrated in the National Security Council of today and highly visible on a daily basis. The National Security Council itself, across the 4 layers of decision-making, all the way up to the full National Security Council, which is headed, of course, by the President, has been expanded to reflect the fact that most of our governments, departments, and agencies have to be at the table when they need to be. In other words, the smaller group of claimants to the national security portfolio, Defense Department, National Security Council, and a little bit of the State Department, now have been expanded to include in national security things like commerce and trade and economic policies and cybersecurity, the war on terror, and the like. It's the operating principle beginning in January of 2009 that I use to encourage the heads of different departments and agencies to be at the table in the Situation Room when issues that they were concerned with were being discussed. The operating principle was, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, and so you'd better be there. Nonetheless, much more remains to be done in terms of making the United States more capable, not only competing but leading in the 21st century, and this is what it's all about. One of the critical shortfalls of our national security portfolio, for example, is the continued absence of any semblance of an energy policy for the United States, a condition that has existed for over 40 years. Surely this is a cross-cutting national security issue of the first order. At best, we have an a la carte policy wherein from time to time, the proponents of a certain sector of our energy portfolio broadcast and fund their opinions. Boone Pickens comes to mind, talking about gas and wind and solar power. Nothing wrong with that. But the fact that we do not publish a national energy strategy that Americans can read and understand where we're going with regard to the use of energy and how we use it and what the potential of the future is for our energy needs is not only a national failure, it's an international failure because other countries look to the United States to lead in these sectors. And a failure to lead only serves to drive home the fact that the leadership that we bring to the table is lacking. This may be an area where the private sector will actually lead the public sector. And I believe that at least for the foreseeable future, the paralysis that we see in the public sector and in the discourses and debates and what it is we're talking about is going to give way to private sector leadership in order to solve some of these problems. To return to the Arab Spring for a moment, it's important to realize that the traditional response package of the 20th century, which was usually purely military in different parts of the world, is probably not what will be needed in each and every crisis we'll face in the 21st century. While each problem will be different, will have different characteristics, each will require at least some diagnosis that includes some thinking with regard to economic solutions, security, of course, and governance. These are remedies that will most likely be applied by international coalitions. Unilateral solutions such as what we used to do in the 20th century could most likely have a negative outcome if not applied with great care and sensitivity. If you take the case of Egypt, and this is a developing issue that no one can really predict how it will turn out, but it's one that's extremely strategic and very, very important that it turn out the right way. In the early days of the upheaval in Egypt, the Army played a very critical role in managing the crisis in a way that resulted in many people not being killed and hurt unnecessarily. The Army advocated a willingness to shift to listen to the people who were rising up and lead Egypt towards more democratic ways. They immediately proclaimed election dates, which have been postponed several times. But the problem there, if you look at it, to illustrate my point, is that there was no need to send in any U.S. troops. But there is a great need for economic development in order to give the people of Egypt a belief that not only the United States, but other developed countries would like to help them solve these problems. So there is a great need for assistance with regard to governance and rule of law, stamping out corruption. In short, the portfolio of our response packages in the 21st century will be different. And it will have to include those kinds of things. And we're struggling with that in terms of how to reform our government, because most of the resources are invested in the Defense Department, some in the State Department. But to have a comprehensive package that is required requires that other agencies in our government also have adequate resources in order to participate. Seems to me one need only look at the frustrations created by Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq to see that the future of each of those nations may well be very different than what we had intended at the onset of this decade. It's not to suggest that U.S. engagement is obsolete or even worse, unneeded. It is most assuredly not. In fact, I think U.S. engagement is more important than ever. But it's the way we engage that will have to be adjusted. And the reason for that is that sovereign governments have sensitivities that are at an all-time high, and no one wants to be seen as buckling under to the U.S. or any other country for that matter. And the other thing that's changed on the global landscape is that as a result of the peer competitors that we face, nations have alternatives that they didn't have just 15 years ago. And they use those alternatives very skillfully, playing us off against others and others off against us in order to do what's in their national interest. So the so-called American century of the 20th century is not necessarily over. There is no magic here in terms of when it starts and when it ends. But the new century will be different. This is the world that our young people will live in and compete in. We can't ignore it. We cannot withdraw from it, as some would have you believe. And we cannot fail unless we're willing to accept a lesser role for this nation. I am convinced that Americans still expect that at the end of the day, the United States will lead the world in most arenas, not just the military domain. That was what led to the Soviet Union's demise. The Soviet Union was a superpower in one area only, and it wasn't enough, and it is not enough for the United States. So to leave you with an encouraging thought, I will tell you that after 65 years of traveling the world over, I'm convinced more than ever that our many friends and allies, the world over, do not want to contemplate a world in which the United States plays a diminished role. They want the United States to be the leader that inspires those who are struggling or suffering, and who, absent that leadership, would have no counterbalance to the world of the autocratic and oppressive regimes. So for our young people, this is your calling, this is your mission, and this is your responsibility. Standing on the sidelines is not acceptable. You must not only understand the severity of the problem we face in a new and more competitive global environment, in a still new century, but also that you must be part of the solution. Yesterday I was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania at the request of the family of the late Congressman John Murtha, who died unexpectedly about a year ago, and the citizens of his district, 12th District of Pennsylvania, had erected a statue in his memory. And in doing some preparatory work on what I might say about the life of Congressman Murtha, who not only rose to great power in the House of Representatives as one of the most senior chairmen over a 36-year career, but he was also a soldier statesman in that he also achieved the rank of colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserve and participated and tried to volunteer during Korea, was not sent to Korea, but served on active duty in Vietnam and distinguished himself, I think, many times by being wherever the troops were so that he could better understand the nature of the conflicts, be they in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. But I was struck by a saying that his great-grandmother told him when he was a young man. And that saying is now carved in stone on the statue that we unveiled yesterday in Johnstown. And his mother, his great-grandmother, said to him, we are put on this earth to make a difference. We are put on this earth to make a difference. And we should remember that we are free as individuals and as a nation, thanks to the collective sacrifice of many who came before us. And will continue to be free as a result of the next greatest generation. You young people here are that generation, and I predict that you will be amazingly successful. Thank you very much for listening to my remarks.